Now, is this a photo or a video?
Classy stuff.
Oh, yeah.
Without further ado, we are blessed today to sit at the feet of Dr. Paul Maier, who hardly needs an introduction. He is an ordained pastor of the Lutheran Church Missouri Synod. He holds a PhD from the University of Basel. Dr. Maier is the Russell H. Siebert Professor of Ancient History Emeritus at Western Michigan University. He has been a 4-term vice president of the Lutheran Church Missouri Synod, and he is the author of both popular and scholarly works. More than 5 million copies of his books are in print, and he has published over 300 articles in scholarly journals. Dr. Maier was born and raised here in St. Louis, and I was interested to find out a few weeks ago when I was visiting with one of our members here, Dr. Robert Drews, that they were childhood friends walking to school together every day. And Robert tells me that back in the day, he always enjoyed being a guest in the Maier home, not only because they were wonderful hosts, but also he loved going down in the Maier basement because there was a wonderful train set that was set up there. I do not know if Dr. Maier still loves model trains or not, but there's no doubting his passion for Christ and his church. Let us welcome Dr. Paul Maier.
Thanks, good buddy. Well said. Thanks so much, Pastor Golden. At this point, they usually say, it's great to be here. The difference is, I really mean it. Yeah, it's place where I grew up. I just love this town. And I exiled myself to Michigan for 50 years. Hard to believe I did that. In any case, I always like to find the texture of a crowd before I begin speaking. In other words, I know many of you are Lutherans, but of what synod? Now, mainly LCMS, I'd guess, but there's a handy-dandy way by which you can always find out the synodical affiliation of somebody who's in a pan-Lutheran gathering. If 2 couples come in a car, it's a dead giveaway. By which I mean, if there's a husband and wife in front and a husband and wife in back, wave them off. They couldn't possibly be Lutheran. Car drives in, 2 men in front and 2 women in back. Need I tell you, LCMS. It's almost the 11th commandment, yeah. Car drives in, 2 women in front and 2 men in back. That'd be the ELCA. Whether or not the men are holding hands. No, we're not going to go there. We're not going to go there. Car drives in, 2 men in front and 2 women pushing the car. That's a Wisconsin Synod. Anyway, great to be with you. And indeed, I want to, instead of telling more jokes, I want to get right to the topic because it is one that I could lecture a whole week on alone. Basically, archaeology is one of the great tools we use in order to ferret out the truth from the past. And ferreting out the truth is terribly important nowadays because you know how our faith is being attacked regularly in the media, outside the media, in movies, in novels, in magazine articles. It seems to be open season on Christianity. And I can't understand the double standard nowadays. It goes something like this. You dare not attack anyone else's religious belief because, well, that's politically incorrect. Except for Christianity. You ever notice? Yeah. Say what you want about Christianity. Draw caricatures of Christ rather than the real item. And the world applauds you, and you don't find that done for any other religious system. Judaism, Islam, it's dangerous to do it for Islam. You may get a fatwa on your head. Or Buddhism or Confucianism, you name it. Nobody gets attacked except Christianity. And it just gets me ticked off that that's the case. Why do we accept that double standard? The answer, however, I think comes every time we have a presidential primary. And I see, for example, 8 Republican candidates on a stage, and they're debating among themselves. Do you notice that 7 always gang up on who? The leader, the one who has the most impetus going into the campaign. You always aim for number 1. That's the reason we're attacked. We are number 1. There is no other phenomenon in the world like Christianity. There is no other religion, way of life, ethical system, ethnic group, you name it, which has the loyalties of over 2,350 million in the present generation alone. That's why we're the target. And frankly, wouldn't you rather be number 1 than be further down the pecking order and have to do the attacking? But nevertheless, we number 1ers ought to be ready with ammunition every time our faith is attacked, not to simply take it sitting back, but to point out the tremendous proof systems we have in terms of guaranteeing that our holy book, the Bible, is different from that of all other world religious systems. One of my seminars is called Christianity in the Competition, in which we explore the Far Eastern religions, the Mid-Eastern religions, the made in America, invented religious systems. And the conclusion is there's no competition. If a person uses his head, there is no competition. I never realized how beautifully defensible our faith is. So we use basically 3 or 4 criteria for proving to the world, if the world's going to listen, that our holy book is part of ancient history, not to be separated as some special religious collection of mythological tales, separated from what actually happened in the past. But our faith is based on a book which is part and parcel of ancient history. How do we determine that? Not just by reading the Bible, it claims to be God's word. I'm not going to use that argument because the atheists and agnostics would say, well, that's ridiculous. No, a historian, and that's my field, and I've had more fun the last 50 years, hard to believe, to kind of beat in the bushes of the ancient world to see if there are ways of checking up on this marvelous account that has changed all of our lives. Now, spectacular things are happening in this account, like miracles, Old Testament and New Testament. Is it possible even to see any fallout from this explosive material? I was convinced way back in Sunday school days that if these spectacular events really happen, well, then we ought to be able to find some fallout in the ancient world. Let me tell you, the fallout is all over the place. I didn't realize how much there is out there in terms of building bridges between secular and sacred, in terms of points of tangency between secular and sacred. And this is so helpful in terms of waging what we call Christian apologetics, that is defending the faith at a time when it's under heavy attack. And I'm sure Craig Parton is going to be doing a similar presentation later on. What are these criteria? First of all, I would say that one of the most overlooked of all of them is the criterion of geography. What? Geography? The last time we studied that was the 5th grade, wasn't it? You know, we got Garmin, global positioning devices. We don't even need maps anymore. But let me tell you, geography is one of the Bible's best friends simply because 93% of the geographical names that are mentioned in the Old and New Testament are known, recognizable, not invented. Some have been dug archaeologically. Now, you yawn at that point and say, yeah, Maier, we know that. I've been to the Holy Land. What's your point? Here's the point. Wallow in the luxury that our holy book has real place names, because the holy books of all the other world religious systems, with one exception, have invented names, especially those that are invented this side of the Atlantic, which are the least convincing of all, quite frankly. When they're borrowing from the Old Testament, for example, fine, those are real places. But when they go beyond that to invent places, that's what they are, pure inventions. Never a trace discovered of them in Central America or where they claim in other places like this. I don't want to particularly mention the faith I'm talking about, but I think you can remember Winter Olympics some years ago. Okay, and presidential candidates. No, we're not going to go into that. But in any case, we have names all over the place. We have names in the Old Testament of oceans and rivers and streams and rivers and brooks, names of mountains and valleys, names of provinces and states and empires, names of villages and metropolises. We have names all over the place. If they were invented, then we'd be in big trouble. And once you get past, I can't guarantee that every name in the Bible is a place I can show you in terms of longitude and latitude on a map today. Cut me some slack, please. I can't tell you where Eden is located, all right? Or Havilah, where the gold is good in the first 10 chapters of Genesis. But beyond that, when you get to Abraham, boy, I tell you, from that point on, we know these locations, and they're so very helpful. To boil it down, I could be debating the representatives of any other world religious system, again with one exception, and I wouldn't have to get beyond the geographical criterion to show that our book is based on real locations. And the exception, of course, would be our Jewish foundation, and that would be the Hebrews also have a holy book, which they call the Hebrew Bible. And it's very reliable also in terms of place names. We call it the Old Testament. Same 39 books. That's the only other faith that has the geography intact. And so it's a thrill, really, to see that we are not talking about mythological reconstructions. We're talking about real people holding forth at real corners of the world, in this case, southeastern Mediterranean coast, and others, Bible lands we call them, and they are real. And again, this won't excite you because you know they're real, but others don't, and they imagine the Bible is just a book of myths, and that these places have as much legitimacy as Oz, where the wizard came from. But this is why I would love to tell you about a cruise tour we're taking on October 2nd to the Bible lands. Oh, it's wonderful. We fly to Rome, get on a cruise ship, and then go from Rome down to Naples, down to Sicily, across to Greece, to Athens, read Acts 17 at Mars Hill where it all happened, and on to Corinth and read chapter 18 of the book of Acts, and on to Ephesus and Asia Minor in Turkey, where the silversmiths' riot took place in the 24,000-seat theater, which we'd show you, then to Mykonos, and then to the Holy Land itself, Galilee, Judea, Jerusalem, Bethlehem, and then back across to Rome and back to the U.S., all for less than $4,000. By the way, when you take a cruise ship, first of all meals are taken care of. 5 meals a day. Breakfast, brunch, lunch, lunper, supper, midnight snack. There's no end to it. Entertainment every night. I'd love to tell you all this, but it would be considered a commercial, so I won't.
And if you cannot afford that package, you can come hear Craig Parton at that exact same time. So.
What competition? Terrible. Anyway, yes, there are flyers in the book table later on. I've really become a softie in my old age. Land tours are fun, but nevertheless, have your baggage out at 6 a.m. The bus leaves, leave you in the dust at 6:30 and so forth, and these legalistic claims. Whereas at a cruise ship, you unpack once, 16 days later, pack again. Such a deal. By the way, you can never fill a cruise ship, so what happens is now they're discounting. Now, whatever price you see, $200 or $300 less, or they'll upgrade you automatically. Oh, I'd love to tell you all that, but I won't. Okay, anyway. Enough of that jazz. On to another criterion. How about, I'm still looking for a name for it. It's the criterion of taxonomy, but who needs that term? The criterion of people. Now, what I mean by that is Who are the people who are supposedly mentioned in your sacred collection of books that has no attachment to reality? Are they real? Check the names out. Is the language similar? Are these names appropriate for that time? Answer is yes, both Old and New Testament. There's not a name there that does not fit the culture of the time. And in terms of personalities, wow. We have 50 people in the Old Testament mentioned both in the Old Testament and also in secular records of the time. So it is very important. If we're talking about the same people and what they do from both angles, this has to be historical fact then, if we believe anything has survived factually from the ancient world. Criterion of people is very, very important. I continue the list of the New Testament. We have about 36 major people. A lot of them are rulers, I'll admit, but they are well-known people also in secular history. Then there's the criterion of history itself, and that is, what other records do we have in the ancient world? Do they ever mention the people like Jesus himself, for example? Or do they mention episodes in his life or in anything that will correspond to the New Testament? The answer is yes, and you can't believe how much material is out there. If we didn't have the Bible itself, we could almost do a good job of reconstructing who Jesus was on the basis of totally secular evidence. And a lot of Christians don't know that. They assume that every last detail about Jesus and the founders of our faith are locked inside the Bible. You believe it or you don't. No, that's wrong. Jesus' name does show up. I can recall some years ago I was making that case in Saturday Review of Literature. And I got a letter from an angry atheist in Florida challenging me. If you could name one place where Jesus is mentioned within a century of his death, he would give me, or any charity I would name, $1,000. Hey, that was 55 years ago. That was $1,000. So I'm salivating away at the typewriter. I gave him 6 names. Asked him to make the check payable to University of Lutheran Church in Kalamazoo, which is my favorite charity. Never heard from that blowhard again. Yeah, I thought a check for $6,000 would be appropriate. But let me just quickly give you 6 major places, and there are probably 12 in all if you add them. But this is in totally secular evidence at a time before Jesus is famous. Jesus is not famous really until the 2nd century in the Roman Empire. But yet already in the first, we have Cornelius Tacitus in Rome talking about the great fire of Rome. And it happened in Nero's watch. Nero got blamed for it. And so Nero wants to blame the Christians for the fire, which he does, saves himself. But then Tacitus goes on, careful scholar that he is, to explain who the Christians are. They're named for a Christ who was crucified by one of our governors, Pontius Pilate. And the pernicious superstition was almost eradicated until suddenly it gained new vigor. You want outside demonstration of Easter Pentecost? Suddenly gained new vigor and flowed as far away as Rome, that common cesspool into which things hateful come from all over the Mediterranean world. Okay, it's a hostile source. Nevertheless, the fact that it's a hostile source and presents this positive evidence on Christianity makes it doubly credible. This is what historians call the criterion of embarrassment. Yeah, it's a neat criterion. It's when in a hostile source, going from alpha to omega, concedes something that doesn't help it at all. In fact, hurts it, but it's got to admit it's true because everybody knows it's true. The hostile source may try to wrap a cocoon around it, explain it away, but what they concede, then 2,000 years later is true. So here you have in a hostile source this positive testimony on Jesus, which says exactly the same thing the New Testament does. And you got another historian named Suetonius, who says that there was a big dispute in the region 14 in Rome, the Jewish quarter, over the claims of Christ. You got Pliny the Younger writing the Emperor Trajan around 110. Remember, that's only 70 years or so after the crucifixion. He writes the Roman Emperor Trajan, he says, what do I do about these Christians? They get up early Sunday morning and they sing hymns to Christ as if he were a god. They're against the law, aren't they? We have Trajan's answer. It's so neat. It was very rare that you get both sides of a correspondence, but Trajan's answer was, yes, sir, Pliny. They're against the law, and so if you can make a perfect case against them, I suppose the law has to be followed. How do you like that for weasel wording? But don't go hunting them out, and don't take any unsigned accusations, which are inconsistent with the liberality of our age. There you see is a case of where the Roman Empire was letting up on the persecutions. The persecutions were not one long horror story. They were on again, off again, on again, off again. And in this case, we have them off again in the beginning of the 2nd century, which is a pretty good time for the church. Not many persecutions took place in the first 80 years of that 2nd century. Again, Jesus' name is mentioned. Or how about the Jewish rabbinic traditions? You bet they mention Jesus. We have his arrest notice. It's not in the Bible. In one of the tractates in the Mishnah section of the Talmud, one of the earliest, most authoritative sections, we have reference to, indeed, Yeshua HaNotzri. That is Joshua of Nazareth, which was his actual name. You have to remember, I hate to bring a good Christian crowd the bad news. His name never was Jesus. It's only our version of the Greek. The Greeks couldn't say Joshua, so they said they couldn't do Yeshua. They said Jesus was as close as they could get it. We transliterate out of the Greek Jesus. So really, if Jesus would have had a driver's license on it, would have been Yeshua HaNotzri. Yeah. But listen, he's a forgiving Lord. He will answer the name Jesus, okay? Not a problem. Please don't lose your faith on my account here. But here we have outside proof for the miraculous. Yep. Okay, here's the arrest notice. Wanted, Yeshua HaNotzri. He shall be stoned because he's practiced sorcery. And if anyone knows of his whereabouts, let him declare it to the great Sanhedrin in Jerusalem. Now, what's sorcery? Sorcery is something extraordinary or supernatural with help from below. What's a miracle? Same thing with help from above. But now in a hostile source, you have the concession that Jesus is doing something supernatural. Wow. And by the way, this is exactly what the Gospels say. Did you ever have a little sympathy for the scribes and Pharisees? I know I did. How are you going to knock a person who's giving sight to the blind, hearing to the deaf, walking ability to cripples? How are you going to knock that person? There's only one way. Call in your spin doctors and say, the devil made him do it. Yeah, that's what the Gospels say. He does these works with the help of Beelzebul. Oh, and then people will back off. That's exactly what the Jewish rabbinical traditions say. So here you have powerful testimony. And then, of course, far and away, the greatest source of any additional historical information we'll ever get beyond Scripture will be in the works of a man who is the greatest defender of Christianity in terms of what he's done for the church. And the paradox is, he never became a Christian. I refer to Flavius Josephus. Born in Jerusalem 4 years after Jesus' crucifixion, and writes this enormous history of the Jewish people in 28 books, or book scrolls. Now, that means about 80 pages of book scrolls. That still means, 8 or 9 books on Jewish history. He writes 28 times the size of one gospel. Why? Well, because this guy got captured during the Jewish war, translated very beautifully for both the Romans and the Jews for the rest of the war, and as a reward, the victors, Titus and Vespasian and Domitian, take him back to Rome with them if he'd like to come with them. Vespasian gave him his old mansion on the Quirinal Hill, subsidized his literary endeavors. This guy made lemonade out of a lemon situation, let me tell you. A Jewish rebel who's now adopted into the imperial Roman family. He doesn't have to worry about his next meal. He didn't have to worry about writing too much. So he has the privilege of writing 28 times the size of one gospel. And by the way, the reason the Gospels are so short is the length of one scroll. Roll them out in a carpet here in front, and it would be about 33 feet long. And more than that, you just can't scroll. It gets too big. And that's the reason why the church can afford one scroll. And by the way, I've often thought, couldn't somebody in the ancient world have blown a few shekels and gotten Mark a longer scroll? 16 chapters, hello? Gee. I think this is the reason that Mark uses that adverb immediately all the time. Jesus immediately crossed the Sea of Galilee. He immediately went out of Jerusalem. I better immediately quit. There's the end of the scroll, you know. This is the reason why Josephus can give us delicious detail like you can't believe. And indeed, this secular source, Josephus, sometimes, first of all, his material beautifully comports with everything we have in the Old or New Testament. Hardly anything sticks out like a sore thumb. But sometimes he even will give us more detail on a biblical event than is in the Bible. I'm not trying to say it's better than the Bible, no. But I'm trying to say that that's how historical our material is, that an outside secular source can not only verify it by telling the same account, but add precious detail. Let me give you an example. The beheading of John the Baptist. Now, if I'd ask you, where did that take place? Don't some wise guy say, at the neck. Yeah, we know that. We're looking for a point on the map. Well, it's a dumb question, Maier. The Bible doesn't tell us. I know it doesn't, but Josephus does. He tells us that this event took place at the northeastern corner of the Dead Sea at a place called Maier, which is kind of catty-cornered from Masada. Now, well, you say, wait a minute, Herod Antipas, that's Herod's most successful son, he was in charge up in Galilee, right? Yeah, but don't forget he also had Perea under his control, which is a Transjordan area that went down to the Dead Sea. So this was their Fort Lauderdale or their Miami Beach. And this is where they celebrated Herod's birthday party. I think where questions are important, and thank goodness that Josephus told us that. And by the way, I will prove that all of you have used Josephus. Usually when I ask how many know about him, I get a glassy-eyed stare, and they say, Joe, who was that? Tell me again about Herod's birthday party that led to the beheading of John the Baptist. You'll tell me all about how things got dull and how dear second wife Herodias provided a special floor show, remember? Her dancing daughter came out, right? Turned Herod's head. Okay, all together now in a great unified chorus. What's the name of the dancing daughter? Salome, you say correctly. Here's the shocker. Her name is not in the New Testament in connection with that episode. But it's got to be in the New Testament. The Concordia Publishing House, Sunday School leaflets, call her Salome. Yeah. No. We know her name is Salome because of Josephus. There's a case of where the church has used Josephus, and I'm convinced there are all kinds of nuggets of pure gold still lurking in his massive history. Now, the Easter tomb on the first day of the week, Mary, the mother of James, and Salome went out to the tomb. Don't you think it's a different gal? Unless this little babe suddenly got religion, I don't know, yeah. Name of 1 out of 5 women in New Testament times was Salome. You know. Finally, here's another one. Who was the first bishop of the Christian church anywhere on earth? And if you answer Simon Peter, you'll be wrong. The answer is James, the Just of Jerusalem, Jesus' half-brother or cousin. We're not going to get into that debate right now. Wouldn't you think the New Testament would tell us how James died? We know he was the first bishop, Acts 15, who's announcing the results of the Apostolic Council of Jerusalem. James. Eusebius, the early church historian, who gives us his wonderful account, first 2.5 centuries of Christianity, tells us that James was indeed the first bishop of the church. And he sat in the bishop's chair of James. He's so proud of that. 2 centuries earlier, when James had it as his own episcopal throne, yeah. Wouldn't you think the New Testament would tell us how this first bishop of the Christian church died? It does not. And guess who does? Josephus tells us that 29 years after Good Friday, quote, then James, the brother of Jesus, who was called the Christ, was stoned to death by the Sanhedrin in the absence of the Roman governor who hadn't gotten there yet. A guy named Albinus. He was so ticked off at this kangaroo court action that he had the high priest thrown out of office. Second time a Roman governor is trying to do the right thing. We have a replication here of the Good Friday trial. 33 A.D., Pontius Pilate, reluctant to condemn Jesus. 29 years later, in the year 62, another Roman governor. So, didn't get there in time, but so angry at what had happened that he arranged to have the high priest canned out of office. The high priest in 33 A.D., Joseph Caiaphas. The high priest in 62 was his brother-in-law, Ananus. Do you see how beautifully we have the corroboration of what's taking place? And again, in this case, the fact that a Jew who didn't convert to Christianity is writing this only makes it doubly credible. This is what I find so intriguing. And then, of course, the longest reference to Jesus in the first century comes 2 books earlier in Josephus. We were told in seminary days we could never use that passage because it had been interpolated, and indeed it had been. Wind the clock back to 1955. Just graduated from Concordia Seminary in St. Louis. I was so ticked off that this longest reference to Jesus had been screwed up that I took it upon myself to write the world's ranking authority on Josephus. Asked him 2 questions. Dr. Paul Winter in London, England. Dr. Winter, do you think Josephus ever mentioned the Christian Jesus here? And if you do, how do you think the passage originally read? 3 weeks later, got an airmail letter from him. I know this does nothing for you with your instant messaging. I know. Cut me some slack. This is 55 years ago. First question, yes, he was quite sure that this was our Jesus, was mentioned by Josephus. And then using his good textual critical sense, and textual criticism is a wonderful thing and not a bad thing. He prized out what he thought were the Christian addenda and left me with a version that I thought was very convincing. Tragically, Paul Winter never knew how close he had come because 2 years after his death, Professor Shlomo Pines of the Hebrew University in Jerusalem discovered a manuscript tradition of Josephus that was not interpolated at that point, and it reads almost word for word like what Paul Winter predicted it would read if it were ever found. Would you like to hear the passage? And by the way, it would be wonderful if somebody would finally retranslate Josephus into modern English, but cut him down to size, because I'm sure this guy worked in his office in Rome with the world's first word processor under a plaque that said, why use 35? Why use one word when 35 will do? Yeah, something like that. Yeah, just kept going. Anyway, yeah, that's the reason for the Josephus Project, to get that thing out. Okay, here is what Josephus really wrote about Jesus, our Jesus, and the interpolated version goes in the notes at the end of the chapter. Right in the middle of Pilate's administration, and by the way, Josephus gives us important additional detail on Pilate that explains why he's acting that way on Good Friday. About this time, there was a wise man called Jesus, and his conduct was good, and he was known to be virtuous. Many people among the Jews and the other nations became his disciples. Pilate, however, condemned him to be crucified and to die. But those who had become his disciples did not abandon their discipleship. They reported that he had come back to life 3 days after he was put in the grave. Accordingly, he was perhaps the Messiah, concerning whom the prophets have reported wonders, and the tribe of the Christians so named after him has not disappeared to the present day. I consider this a remarkably fair, outside view of who Jesus was by a person who didn't necessarily believe in him, but is trying to write fair and honest history. So that terribly important passage goes right back where it belongs. So those are the three criteria we use then: the criterion of geography, the criterion of people themselves and their names, criterion of history, and now we come to the neatest one of all, the criterion of archaeology. The neat thing about this one is that it's the smoking gun from the ancient world. What's neat about this one, it's the DNA evidence that will turn a trial on its ear. It's the hard evidence, the material evidence from the past, which now ranks number one in terms of credibility and usability in anybody's scale, because here is Exhibit A, Exhibit B, Exhibit C. And that's the reason why it's a thrilling thing that God has given us. It's just amazing, as the attacks on Christianity grow, so does the hard evidence grow even faster. Now, we got to get the right idea about archaeology. We think it's an old discipline. We even have sympathy for the poor archaeologist because his career is in ruins. You're very generous. No, not too funny. Here's a chaser. Ladies, I don't know, maybe too late, I don't know, but try to marry an archaeologist, because the older you get, the greater interest your husband will take in you. Yeah. No, scientific archaeology is only about 140 years old. Scientific archaeology came along in 1870 AD. Before this, it was like treasure hunting. Josephus says that Herod the Great dug outside of his winter palace in Jericho and found some old items. That's not scientific archaeology. And the people in Naples were told to go down to Pompeii because, hey, if you dig through the volcanic ash, you can get a beautiful statue for your atrium, and they would do that. That's treasure hunting. That's not archaeology. Scientific archaeology did not begin until 1870, and look at what has been discovered in the century and a quarter since that time. An amazing amount of material. Now, it's interpreted two different ways. We have biblical minimalists who feel horribly embarrassed by this evidence because 90% of it immediately confirms a biblical record. Now, they begin, of course, with a blind disdain for the Bible. It shows all over their scholarship. And they try to break down all the bridges between the secular evidence of archaeology and the sacred evidence. It's a dirty pool. It's not honest scholarship at all. Now, I admit that when you dig in Palestine, Israel, Jordan, or wherever else, you should dig with an open mind. If somebody grabs a spade and wants to go over there to prove the Bible by archaeology, they probably should take a spade away. If a person goes over there to disprove the Bible, take his spade away also. You dig for the truth. Let the chips fall where they may. And what's amazing are the number of chips that incline toward immediately confirming the biblical record. So today you've got biblical minimalists, a dying breed, really. Lemche and Thompson are two big names at the University of Copenhagen, for example. They impress only their students with their smashing of any possible bridge work between the two. But biblical maximalists began with one of the great Semiticists of our time, William Foxwell Albright, taught at Johns Hopkins. He's the father of biblical archaeology. And of course, there's a tremendous debate over whether there should be such a discipline. Hey, right there, you've biased it ahead of time, haven't you? William Dever, for example, in Arizona, is constantly hitting that particular gong. That, oh, it's wrong. You shouldn't call it biblical archaeology. Well, wait a minute. If we're talking territorial, and you're not saying pro or con, why can't there be American Indian archaeology? Biblical archaeology. So I think Dever's wrong on that one. I think he's come around too in terms of defending it. It's been lots of fun to see what the good earth has produced for us just in terms of the discoveries that are being made. Now, basically, we're not going to spend any time on what is archaeology. I'm sure you know what it is. You dig in the earth's crust to see what artifacts you might find. What's an artifact? Artifact is something that humankind didn't put there. I'm sorry, just the opposite. Artifact, yeah, hello. Artifact is something that nature didn't put there, but humankind did. In other words, somebody's been here with intelligence. Otherwise, if it's simply natural, that's nature. But when you find humankind coming along, they love to do things with their hands, even old Stone Age human beings and so on, up to the Neolithic age and the Middle Age. They have always been, through their tools, building things, making things. What are the hard evidence that are going to survive? The stone foundations of city walls and buildings. The weaponry, made of what? If it's lousy, clubbed on the end of a stick, then it's old Stone Age. If the stone is nicely cut now or so, there's an edge to it, and it's New Stone Age. And if it's bronze or iron, we're in the Middle Age. And this, of course, is all chronological. Same for their tools, same for their cosmetics and their jewelry, the hard elements that, especially in a dry climate, like the Near East, will survive the test of time. So you dig down then in what's called a tell. This is a buried city. Usually they'll do an exploratory trench first to see how many strata go down to bedrock. And then, of course, they have the real problem when they excavate laterally. Which stratum are you going to favor? You know, if you want to favor 1500 BC, that'll wipe out any New Testament stratum. And so it's a very difficult decision they have to make. Very often, however, everybody's favorite stratum is the 1st century AD. You know why. Nevertheless, you have various methods of preserving the past. Kathleen Kenyon, for example, the dean of biblical archaeologists, dug for 30 years at Jericho, and she used a bulk debris method. And that is, she will leave these bulks standing and dig only around them, showing exactly the terrain at the point where she was digging. So that later on, when better and better scientific methods are devised for analyzing the past, they'll have fresh material to work on, and it won't all be gone. Good for her. So then you may have discussions on dating systems. You see the hard elements that have survived. Pottery, for example, is very, very important because this can be dated depending on the style of the pottery, what it looks like. Is the owner's name on the handle? This kind of thing. And so on. And so you can finally work up for a given tell or mound what the archaeology may contain at that point. Usually they will know ahead of time what mound this is, and they will start digging. Then, of course, what they find is terribly important. The greatest thing you can always find is writing. Poor William Foxwell Albright dug 35 years at Gezer and never found any writing. But that's the most important thing you can find. That's why the Dead Sea Scrolls were such a big deal at Qumran when they excavated the caves there and found the tremendous discovery of these manuscripts in 1974. But you can also find human bones, bodies, and that's always a terrible problem because if the Hasids, if the Orthodox know about that, they'll shut down the dig. They'll absolutely parade in front of it with signs because archaeologists dare not exhume a body that's been buried. So very often they'll keep a human discovery silent as much as they can so that the Hasidics don't come along and interrupt your archaeology. And there's a problem of theft, problem of war, the terrible things happening in the museums in Mesopotamia. When the Taliban came along in Afghanistan, did the same thing there, and now the ISIS people, they've only gotten about 80% of the Baghdad Museum materials back again, the terrible losses in terms of the great discoveries being made. Years ago, you used to be able to take the stuff with you if you were the archaeologist and put it in the Louvre Museum in Paris or the British Museum in London, but no longer. Oh, let me tell you, it stays in the country of origin, and therefore it's amenable to these the disasters that happen in the Near East, even as I speak. Basically, then, let's move ahead now to the archaeology of the Old Testament. Tell me when the hour is up, Mr. Chairman. To be sure, when you're dealing with the Old Testament, we're dealing with material further back than the New Testament, and therefore we're prone to find more material that will be in the younger strata, those nearer the top. And again, let's remember when you go down, you're going down in time also, earlier and earlier and earlier. Not always. When they've kept the place clean and visited by tourists throughout the ages, there's not much difference in height. The Colosseum in Rome, for example, is only 2 or 3 feet under the modern pavement of the Via dell'Impero, the great Mussolini roadway built out to it. The Parthenon in Athens is built on top of the Acropolis. Hasn't changed its altitude in the last 2,400 years since it was built. So there are places that are still the same altitude, yet there are other places that have been destroyed and rebuilt, destroyed and rebuilt. That's going to provide a rubble layer each time on which you will then build a new city. Jerusalem, for example, has been destroyed and rebuilt 13 times since Jesus' day. Therefore, if you're looking for an authentic site in Jerusalem, in the first century, it better be 15 to 20 feet down. The least convincing site in Jerusalem today is the upper room, because it's still an upper room. Full of Gothic arches, and the Gothic arch will not be invented until 1100 AD, okay? So, yeah, whenever I take a group over, they have a handy-dandy 1 to 10 scale for authenticity. And we have to use a local guide, and so while he's talking to my group, I hardly ever use a 10 except for the Sea of Galilee. Yeah, okay. But I'm known to stand behind him, and 1 is forget about it, why did you ask? and hold up while he's lecturing. Oh, boy. Yeah, and that upper room's a -5. Yeah, okay. Anyway, but the Damascus Gate in Jerusalem, which is built on the Roman Cardo, which is a main north-south avenue. We can show you the Damascus Gate there today at street level, but look over the balustrade, and there you find the ditch in front of the walls of Suleiman the Magnificent, and there's Hadrian's Damascus Gate 18 feet down. 18 feet down. He came the century after Jesus. So again, depth is important in terms of authenticity. So is the paper trail, very important for authenticity. How long has the church regarded this as the authentic relic or spot or place? The reason I really can't get excited over the Shroud of Turin is its paper trail is too short. It only goes back 6 centuries. I'm not trying to say I can prove that it is or isn't the burial cloth of Jesus, but paper trail doesn't go back far enough for me. But it could be authentic. I'm not trying to bury it on that reason. But in the Old Testament, even there, in the patriarchal era, let's begin with that. Where does Abraham come from? Ur of the Chaldees. Critics in the late 1800s used to laugh at that one, Ur of the Chaldees. If they knew about Wizard of Oz, they'd say it would have the same authenticity as Oz, another 2-lettered location. But just at the turn of the 1900s, Sir Leonard Woolley, a British archaeologist, was digging near the mouth of the Euphrates River, which had joined the Tigris at that point, and there was one exit, no, it was a separate exit, I should say. And at the mouth of the Euphrates, there was a ziggurat. A ziggurat is a temple tower, which is typical of the Mesopotamians. And in the top of the temple tower came the identity of the city. You know, everything but the Kiwanis sign and the Lions Club meets and so forth, on Tuesdays. Yeah, population, so and so. Ur of the Chaldees. So we know Abraham's own town, and many of the linguistic hints in the names of people and places are known at that time, even though dating the patriarchs is a little difficult, generally placed 2000 BC to about 1700 BC. Now, when you come to Egypt, we should find traces, and again, critics, you love Egypt because they try to say there's no correlation between anything in Egypt and the claim that there was an imprisonment of the Israelites there or an exodus and so forth. Well, that's wrong. We have the Merneptah stele. What's a stele? A stele is, something about this high with a rounded top, and it's a slab of stone. And the Merneptah stele talks about the conquests of Merneptah, including those along the Mediterranean coast, northeast of Egypt, where he says, Israel, his seed is not, implying he had vanquished them. So the name shows up. All the names are appropriate. Moses, I need not tell you, one of the great pharaohs, the Napoleon of ancient Egypt, was Tutmosis III. So the name itself is very, very Egyptian. And indeed, in the Exodus, we have a moving people here. We're not going to find heavy foundation stones as the bases of their walls, are we? I don't think so. And please, people, we're not exactly sure of the route of the Exodus. Maybe some of the remains of their encampments may still be found. Now, you got to watch out for one problem, and that is biblical sensationalists. You'll see chariot wheels that were found at the base of the Red Sea, and about once a week I get an inquiry from somewhere, are these real or not? Unfortunately, they seem to be too good to be true, and there is some hoaxing going on, I regret to say. The final jury is still out on those chariot wheels, but stay tuned as to their authenticity or not. Time? We
We
will.
are just a couple minutes shy of the hour, and a question has come in.
Oh, good.
that-
Oh, look at that. Oh,
In fact,
electronics.
This came in
Wonderful.
about the time you spoke your first word, and I've been holding off asking you to get to this point.
Okay, team, we're going to pick up Old Testament archaeology after the break, okay?
Can I ask this question
Please,
then? All right.
please, by all means.
So, what is your opinion about the revised Egyptian chronology?
The revised Egyptian chronology. Again, the whole thing depends on when Israel came into the Promised Land. 1400 BC, according to most conservative scholars, 1230 BC, according to the archaeology. So again, you pays your money, takes your choice on that one. The jury is still out. We've not come to a final decision.
All right.
Any raised hands here?
Yeah. Are there other questions that have been waiting to be asked? All right. So, do we have a microphone for Pastor Lang? All right. And I will repeat the question so everyone can hear.
Cool.
What's your opinion on the James ossuary, authentic or a forgery, and why?
All right. So, the James ossuary, authentic,
Very good.
forgery.
This will be in the New Testament archaeology, but nevertheless, let's get to that immediately. I wish I could say, hey, isn't this great? I've been translated. I hear chimes. Is this the promised land? Yeah, okay.
This is what happens when the organist goes out of town for her grandson's wedding. Nobody's here to turn it off.
Okay, the deal is this. There was an ossuary discovered without any adornment, but it has on it some neat Aramaic. Yaakov bar Yosef Akui de Yeshua, James, son of Joseph, brother of Jesus. Hello, those three names are exactly in the proper order we have for the Holy Family, right? Well, there's a tremendous brouhaha that took place in Israel over the authenticity of that thing or lack of it. Now, first of all, no bones were found inside the bone box. The bone box had been beating around in the antiquities market for the last 35 years, all of which is a negative in terms of authenticity, because after the break, I'm going to give you a true discovery of the bones of the first biblical personality ever really discovered in his ossuary. It's sensational in the best sense, so please come back. But anyway, but anyway, in contrast to that one, this one is very, very marginal. It all depends on Akui de Yeshua, brother of Jesus, whether or not that was a later part of the inscription or not. Now, the Israel Antiquities Department decided to prosecute the owner, Oded Golan, an engineer in Tel Aviv, for forgery. And they did find in his laboratory various cutting tools and soil from the cigar boxes from different areas of the Holy Land. But this guy swears that no, he didn't touch that thing, and it was only a French epigrapher named Maier who figured out that what this inscription meant. And then he went on trial. The darn trial lasted about a year or two, and believe it or not, the result is they did not prosecute him successfully for forgery. So I don't know what this means. The editor of BAR, Herschel Shanks, is quite convinced that this is a true relic of the first bishop of the church, James the Just of Jerusalem. And it may be, but I'm going to give you a much better one after the break.
All right. Thank you, Dr. Maier. All right. Dr. Maier, a few questions. To start off with one that dovetails with where we left off with Old Testament archaeology and the like. Are the Hyksos the Israelites?
The Hyksos, as you well know, come between the Old Kingdom of Egypt and the Second Intermediate period, and they may indeed, if they were not Israelites, they were cousins to them as a Semitic tribe, and therefore this is why you could have a Pharaoh come along who recognized Joseph and people like that and gave them refuge in Egypt. So there's a lot going for the idea that when the Hyksos invasion took place, this is also when Joseph and brothers went down to Egypt.
All right, very good. Now, staying also with items that correspond to Old Testament archaeology, give us just your thoughts about the Ebla tablets and the Tel Dan stele.
Tel Dan's we're going to come to in the discussion with David. As far as the Ebla tablets are concerned, boy, that's a wholly new horizon that's been unveiled for us in terms of third millennium BC documents. That one discovery has quadrupled the number of epigraphic, that is, written documents we have from the Near East. The one discovery at Tel Mardik. It was about 30 years ago they discovered a huge mound. Wasn't discovered, the thing looms over the countryside. In fact, it was so impressive at Tel Mardik, which is 30 miles south of Aleppo. And it was so impressive they thought it had to be a medieval Arab mound until they started digging and found out that this was the citadel of ancient Ebla, which is mentioned in the Old Testament once or twice, and also in the records of the Sumerians. Ebla was not even known to exist other than a name in the book of Genesis, because one of the kings of Ebla was named Eber, the father of the Eberus. Hebrews to you? Yeah, here's the eponymous ancestor of the Hebrews. And naturally, this immediately got the Syrians furious because they felt that now the Israelis are going to try to claim material all the way north of Damascus. And that wasn't the case at all. But it shows how politics can get in the act. The Ebla tablets are being deciphered. 15,000 of them were discovered as the Royal Library at Tel Mardik, and they will not be available until about 50 years from now when the translations are complete. But once again, they take even one lousy name mentioned in the Old Testament, and indeed we have it now in stone and in epigraphy as well.
All right, a couple more questions. Would you please...
Tell Dan and David, we'll come to that.
All right. Will you please expound a bit on how archaeology has contributed to the support of biblical creationism?
Well, when it comes to creation, I wouldn't use archaeology as much as simply the way the whole universe is composed in the first place. This is the area more of the scientist, I would think, in terms of how the order of creation as we find it in Genesis answers very well to the idea of plants coming before animals and so forth and down the line. So I would use biology and natural sciences rather than archaeology per se, because archaeology is only there after humankind have shown up and are messing around with whatever they found from the good earth. I'm holding these intentionally short so we don't keep you till 8 this evening.
All right. Although I don't think many would mind if we stayed that long. All right. Now going to the New Testament, who was Salome that was at the foot of the cross?
Salome, there's a different Salome. You got to remember, 1 out of 5 women have the name peace, shalom, Salome. And so she is also related to some of the other Jameses we have, a different gal entirely. Herod's had a sister named Salome also, the dancing daughter of the daughter of Herodias, Salome. There are plenty of those around.
So in the end, we don't know a whole lot of details regarding. All right. Are there other specific questions coming from the audience before we kick back to Dr. Maier? All right, Dr. Maier.
When we come to the invasion of the Promised Land itself, a big brouhaha has erupted between biblical minimalists and maximalists. They claim, for example, that the ruins at Jericho are key to it, and Kathleen Kenyon has already told you, dug there for 25 years, never found any walls that cascaded down, and never found a given kind of pottery that should have been there if indeed the Israelites had invaded at that time. And so, again, this looked like it was a put down on any relationship between the destruction of Jericho by Joshua, according to the Bible, and what you find today. Turns out, though, that one of the big mistakes made by archaeologists is that nearly all these excavations expose less than 1 or 2% of the thing they're excavating. And so the result is, it turns out she wasn't digging at the right place. Bryant Wood came along, another American archaeologist, and dug at another corner where they did find exactly the kind of pottery that should have been there at that stratum. What do you know? And he also found walls on top of each other, cascading against one another. So, there goes her argument down in flames. Stay tuned, and let's go back to these sites and see if indeed there may be an exception, which in this case certainly proved to be the case. Now, when you have the invasion of the Holy Land, you have the biblical minimalists saying, no, it wasn't an invasion, forget the Joshua conquest. It was more like a little infiltration, more like an assimilation kind of a thing. The jury may be out on it, but generally nothing has ever been discovered there that can't have been according to the biblical record. Even the ruins at Ai, remember Ai, Achan's theft, and that kind of thing. For a long while they couldn't find that until they did find it indeed. Now, the biblical minimalists show up best when I talk about Israel Finkelstein. He's an Israeli archaeologist, obviously, who loves to saw off the very limb in which he's sitting. So many of them do, and so many Old Testament experts who ought to know better have kind of sold out the idea that this is reliable material, and then they try to denounce what they previously praised. Bart Ehrman is a case in point. He's chairman of the religion department, University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, and he's also an agnostic. And he had a very conservative upbringing, and he's fighting against this now for the rest of his life. And that's the reason he is such a champion of the Bible's not reliable. Well, people like that, Israel Finkelstein and others, have a time grid which is 100 years off of everybody else's. Now, the normal time grid is David was 1000 BC, nice round number. And again, there's nobody doubting that David was in charge of a kingdom of Judea and so on, except people like Finkelstein and others. They claim that all the great ruins attributed to David in Jerusalem were done instead by Ahab, one of the kings in the northern tribes. And what do you know? It turns out that Ahab is 100 years after David. So, get it? Garbage in, garbage out. You have a wrong time scheme right there. And so whatever right data you plug into that the wrong program in your computer, garbage in, garbage out. Or you can have a perfectly good working computer with the right program, put in the wrong data, garbage in, garbage out is the expression. And so here too. No, indeed. David's name has been discovered, much to the discomfiture of all the critics. Because a lot of critics were saying, as a matter of fact, Harper's Magazine, this wonderful, venerable magazine ever since the Civil War, had a huge article on false testament about 7 years ago, in which the Old Testament was their whipping boy. And it showed a picture of the Old Testament being eaten away by termites with a few bulk pages left, and that was it. And here the argument was, not even David's name has been discovered, but it has. And somebody raised the question at Tel Dan in northern Israel. Avraham Biran, the great Israeli archaeologist, found a stele, that is one of these signs, which was a victory, triumphal stele, talking about how Asa of the house of David had conquered Baasha, king of Israel, with the help of Ben-Hadad of Syria. Again, now David's name showing up in stone for the first time. Well, the biblical minimalists had a fit about that. Are you sure that wasn't a forgery? Didn't somebody come along and carve that? And they wouldn't examine it very closely. See, when you confront them with the actual evidence, even then they won't accept it. What kind of a mind should be doing scholarship like this, which is so hopelessly biased that it will refuse to change its whole approach? Never underestimate the lack of reliability from a biased mind. I kid you not. When archaeology first came along in 1870, all your German higher critics were poo-pooing it. They were dissing it. They were dismissing it. They were saying, look, untried discipline. Besides which, the results of archaeology don't support our theories, therefore they must be wrong. You know, ridiculous comments like that. Archaeology had a hard time getting started. Not today. I mean, everybody correctly realizes this is your number one kind of evidence. After that, you can go on. But this is number one evidence. So the only way you can ever then oppose the results that are pro-biblical is, say, forgery, which is a pathetic excuse. So no, it turns out that David and his king, in fact, the Elat Mazar, the granddaughter of the great Dean Benjamin Mazar, of Israeli archaeologist, is working in Jerusalem with what does seem to be the palace walls of David's palace, indeed. And so we're going to get more and more evidence coming out from the good earth. Stay tuned, folks. Before you people pass on, there will be additional dramatic archaeological discoveries. And if past is any precedent, it'll support something in the biblical record magnificently. It'll happen again and again. So anyway, these biblical minimalists say that David didn't exist. Or if he did exist, he was a little hilltop chieftain in charge of a little quarter south of the temple area in Jerusalem. That isn't the David we know from the Old Testament, who shows up, indeed, as setting up quite a kingdom indeed. And the same for Solomon and so on. But these people now try to dehistoricize them until we get to about 750 BC. Then suddenly, these Judaic and Israelite kings suddenly take on actuality. Why? Well, because Hezekiah dug a tunnel, okay, from the spring Gihon under the walls of Jerusalem to the pool of Siloam, in order that Jerusalem will have plenty of water at the time the Assyrians come and invest the city in siege work. The tunnel's been discovered. Unless you think it's not Hezekiah's, there's a huge inscription at the pool of Siloam end of it in which Hezekiah talks about the tunnel. This is the tunnel. Here's the history of it. I said 2 teams of workmen starting at both ends, and they tunneled into the center of the massive rock here, and they were only about 5 feet off from one another when they found each other. And he's proud of that tunnel. The inscription in some of the earliest Hebrew writing is in the Museum of the Ancient Orient in Istanbul, from when the Turks took over that area. So suddenly, of course, everybody's silent now when it comes to Hezekiah and the kings in the northern country as well. From now on, they're all historical. Well, isn't that interesting? One wonders then, why are they suddenly historical? Only 2.5 centuries after David. Hello, the answer is, to what extent will these absolute biased opinions finally open up their minds to the obvious truth? It's just disgusting to see what they do. And so it goes. If you don't like Hebrew records, let's go to Assyrian records. The Assyrians come along in Sargon II in 722 BC. You know what they did in terms of the 10 northern tribes. And no, they didn't come over in the Atlantic and be fun. In 8 round vessels that had windows on top and windows on the bottom in case they flipped over. still have light. You know, where do you put the cork to keep the Atlantic from coming in? And guided by 2 luminous stones. In any case, the 10 lost tribes, of course, are lost of the Asiatic intermarriage and whatever else. But don't forget, the Assyrians then come down to Jerusalem also, where they shut Hezekiah inside Jerusalem like a caged bird. And Sennacherib is now the great king. And he comes along, of course, and is going to vanquish Hezekiah, although the Assyrian records themselves do not claim that they actually defeated the guy. The Assyrian records show up on what we call the Sennacherib prism, Prism. I'm going to pass this around, and this is in the absence of color slides. There you go. And you'll see on the right side of the page what Sennacherib's 6-sided prism looks like. The ancients wrote on anything they felt like. They can write on a sign, like a stele. They can write on a brick if they wish. They can write on something that looks like a corn cob and go laterally. They can do on 6 sides of a hexagonal document, which is what we're passing around. That thing today is in the Museum of the Ancient Orient, University of Chicago in Illinois. The famous Sennacherib prism, in which he also claims after conquering the 10 northern tribes, he went down to Jerusalem and shut Hezekiah up inside the city like a caged bird. But what do you know? He doesn't say he eliminated them from the face of the earth, does he? He doesn't say he conquered them. And indeed, you know the biblical version is the angel of the Lord smote the army, and there were 35,000 casualties at dawn. Quite a different version, right? Well, now, how do we decide? I would call to witness Herodotus, the father of history, the great Greek. He also, when he was down in Egypt, heard the story about Sennacherib and his failed conquest of Judea. The reason was, says Herodotus, a whole horde of field mice attacked the army of Sennacherib the night before he was to attack Jerusalem, ate all the leather thongs that held their armament together, so they were left now defenseless, and they took off out of there as fast as they could. Methinks Herodotus defends the biblical record better than the Assyrian hexagonal prism does. But the very fact that we're talking about the same people and the same events and the same occasions shows how historically grounded our Old Testament is. That this is not some special mythology concocted by the Israelites. This is real stuff involving real people. And so it goes. My favorite is the famous Cyrus Edict. Now remember when they were in the Babylonian captivity for 50, 70 years or so, then Cyrus the Great, an unusual guy, king of Persia, released the Jews and let them go back to their promised land, and advised other neighbors of the Jews, like the Samaritans, to help them rebuild the temple. This is why this Cyrus character, correctly called Cyrus the Great, shows up both well in the Old Testament as God's instrument and also in secular records as well. Well, the very edict and the wording which you find about Cyrus's edict freeing the Jews is on this, looks like a pregnant corn cob. It's like that, but it bulges in the middle, and there you have the Edict of Cyrus. Again, beautifully, almost the same wording you find in the Old Testament. I mean, do the stones cry out, or do they cry out? Yeah, they do. And again, archaeology just beautifully, time and time again, supports a biblical record. You don't hear that. No, you always hear the minimalist Kant trying to explain everything away, saying that this is inaccurate, or it's a forgery, a salted dig, or whatever else. It just isn't fair. It isn't fair. And we do not get adequate reporting on the properly said sensational finds that have been made. And so it goes. We have the ossuary of the bones of King Uzziah, which have not been touched all these centuries. And probably it is time to see what they look like and where they are. I'd love to continue in the Old Testament. We got to hop to the Newer. We're never going to finish this. Once we get to the New Testament, we have so many points of tangency with the life of Jesus. Sometimes there are structural tangencies. And I maintain when you check something out like the Church of the Nativity at Bethlehem, this justifiably comes under the heading of archaeology. Why do I say that? Simply because there is a lot of authenticity on that structure. Years ago, before I did the research, I assumed that, well, we all knew that Jesus is born in Bethlehem, but do we have to say that it happened right here under the high altar? I used to say, yeah, somewhere in or near here. We're not going to get closer than that. And on my handy-dandy scale, I gave it only a 5. Until I finally did more research on that structure. Let me tell you, that structure goes back 1,700 years. That's a long paper trail. Constantine the Great, urged on by his pious mother Helena, wanted to commemorate the place where Jesus was born. So his engineers and architects interviewed the Christian bishop of Jerusalem, a guy named Makarios, blessed, and he said, piece of cake, I can show you where it happened. That's where they had their Christmas picnics. And indeed, so he built the church there. And indeed, what you see today is a structure rebuilt over it by Justinian, the great Byzantine Eastern emperor. But the guide will show you a wooden trapdoor, and they'll pull it up and show you underneath beautiful mosaic from Constantine's own magnificent floor. Very complicated, interesting mosaic design from 326 AD. Now that's pretty impressive, going back 17 centuries. Now let's go further back. Let's go to Origen, one of the most brilliant minds in the history of the Christian church. He knew Hebrew better than the rabbis. And he spent the last part of his life in Palestine. And he said every time he went to Jerusalem, even the pagans there were willing to tell anyone who would listen where that great Jesus was born, whom the Christians worshiped. Now here's the deal. Little Bethlehem had nothing going for it till David was born, and then they forgot about that till 1,000 years later, Jesus is born. What brought the tourists now and the pilgrims to Bethlehem? The place where Jesus was born. Would they lose sight of this? I don't think so. This was their Eiffel Tower. This was their Tower of London. This is their Colosseum, their Parthenon, their Acropolis. This brought the tourists and their money. Why would they forget it? I don't think they would. Let's go back even another century. Now we're coming within a couple generations of Jesus' birth. Called to witness, Justin Martyr, one of the great defenders of the church. He said, and he was born in Samaria, by the way, and a neat background. He was a pagan philosopher, and he searched the various philosophical schools for the best one of all. When he came to Christianity, that philosophy converted him, of all things. Strange way to come into the faith, but there it was. But anyway, he's born in Samaria, next door to Judea. He said that he could point out in Bethlehem the grotto or cave or cavern where Jesus was born. Jesus was not born in an above-the-ground, olive-carved wood stable that we're used to in our Christmas creches. He was born in a stable or cavern. It was used as a cavern or grotto that was used as a stable. And here then we have almost a 1,900-year paper trail going back to that cavern, which is under the high altar, 18 feet down, of the Church of the Nativity of Bethlehem. Some of these structures you shouldn't laugh at, or say, well, we can't be sure. And this alone is, I think, a Department of Archaeology showing that, wow, it must have been some kind of life to inspire this kind of adulation and monument marking through the centuries. Oh, yeah. Same thing with the house of Peter up in Capernaum. There I used to also, not really give it much credibility, but then I found that even those who despised the faith were agreeing that probably this was indeed the house of Peter. Then suddenly I had to go back to the research. A lot going for it. It is a block or two south of the synagogue at Capernaum, the very synagogue where Jesus taught, not in the superstructure, but in the foundations. What they did, because this is sacred territory, is to rebuild a synagogue over sacred foundations. But the foundation stones are still there, black basalt rock. Those stones heard Jesus teach. Yep. And then just a block south of that is the house of Peter, going toward the Sea of Galilee. How do we know it's the house of Peter? Whenever Constantine consecrated a spot, again, he's building these basilicas all over to mark the most important stations in Jesus' life. So at Capernaum, which was the headquarters of Jesus' Galilean ministry, he also then builds a church there over Peter's house. How do we know? Because wherever Constantine went, he put a double octagon stone wall around the thing he's commemorating. Did that at Bethlehem, Jerusalem, Church of the Holy Sepulchre, and also here in Galilee. And what do you know? We have the minutes of the diary of a pilgrim nun from Spain. Her name was Egeria. Came through there in 384. And she writes in her diary, today we worshiped at the very house of Peter where Jesus lived, which the Emperor Constantine has converted into a church. And indeed, it's a two-room dwelling. They took the middle wall out to make an oblong sanctuary in the first Christian church in Galilee. The wall's plastered, the only plaster in all of Capernaum. On the plaster are pilgrim graffiti in 7 or 8 different languages, names of the apostles and Jesus, pictures of ships, fish hooks. And in the floor, crushed gypsum, the only floor you're going to see like that in Capernaum. Found fish hooks, again, showing that this was Peter's house. Pretty thrilling discoveries like that are coming thick and fast. Things you wouldn't expect. Do we have any boats sailing in and out of Jesus' Galilean ministry? You bet. They're all over the place, aren't they? Jesus using Peter's boat as a marine pulpit. And that's a good idea because sound travels over water beautifully. And then after that, they have this big fishing party. And, they cast the nets down and like to sink the ship almost because they had so many. The great draft of fish. Or the feeding of the 5,000. They go back across the lake that night, and there you see a spirit walking on the water, and Peter wants to join him, remember? And for a while, that spiritual surfer's doing pretty well until he sees a wave come. Well, boat again, isn't it? Or, again, the stilling of the tempest. Boats, boats, boats. And not only the big stories, folks, but also the little ones. Whenever you're reading about Jesus' Galilean ministry, how often you come to the phrase that Jesus and his disciples went into a boat and went on the other side. Again and again you find that. So naturally, it would be nice to see what one of these boats looked like. Okay, spring of 1986, no rain had fallen for weeks on end. Driest spring in memory. And the water level of the Sea of Galilee drops. And so now the thing has a vast gravelly halo surrounding the whole lake. So one evening, 2 brothers from Kibbutz Ginosar are out walking, and they see the remains of a buried ship's hull. Couldn't believe it. And indeed, they thought it had to be a medieval hull because the wood's still pretty good. So then they start digging away, and Murphy's Law took over. And again, the rains came. Yeah. Now it's going to threaten to drown out this site. So they loaded gunny sacks with sand, made a cofferdam around the whole thing, and then they called in 3 teams of archaeologists. They worked 24 hours and liberated that hull in 11 days. Then they surrounded the whole thing with fiberglass so they could now sail it back on shore, where they had built a huge aquarium for it, so they could immediately resubmerge the wood in Sea of Galilee water, because otherwise it would have dried and turned to powder. The care with which these people take care of things coming out of their own land is just wonderful. Can you see that happening in St. Louis County? Hey, call the garbage detail. Get this wreck out of here. I mean, you know. Just wonderful. Okay, now then they called in the world's ranking marine archaeologist to date it. One of the Bass brothers. He flew in from Texas. He took one look at it. This is a first century boat, he said. First century BC, first century AD. They're only 1,500 years off. How did they know that was the case? Well, mortise and tenon construction was the only time they did that. Then they did a carbon-14 test on it. And you bet the thing turned out to be 1950 BP before the present. And indeed, it was dead right on the dating. And this is exactly the kind of boat that Jesus and the disciples used. Could all 13 of them have climbed on board this ship? Yes. This shell is 27 feet long, and beam is 7.5 feet wide. It would have held 15 Galileans. Today it would hold about 10.5 or 11. Taller and heavier across 2,000 years. Exactly. Hey, but this thing now explains the stilling of the tempest. Back in Sunday school days, I was always asking the Sunday school teacher questions that really got her pretty angry. I wasn't trying to put her on, but I was always missing the point. For example, healing of the cripple in Peter's house in Capernaum. Remember, they opened the roof up, let the guy down, remember? Well, I was pleased that Jesus could heal the cripple. But teacher, what did they do about the roof afterwards? They're hard enough to keep dry, aren't they? Oh, Paul, you missed the point. All right, then in the case of stilling of the tempest, I was pleased that Jesus could turn the wind off and that kind of thing. But teacher, how could Jesus sleep through a storm in the first place? Paul, ask your father. Yeah. Hey, but that was a decent question, and now we have the answer. We have the answer now, yeah, because of this wreck. The only place where there was a mast block was toward the front of the ship, and yet there were stanchions for rowers, 2 to a side. So this crazy thing could either be rowed or sailed, and you don't find boats like that in Ladue or the Mississippi or anywhere else in the world today. If you're a sailboat hull, you are consigned to being a sailboat hull. You got a centerboard, transom, you got a keel, right? There's another way to do it. You can take a runabout hull, turn it into a sailboat hull by the use of a ballast sack. You take a gunny sack full of sand and stow it on the windward side of the hull at the center, and that will accommodate the wind and go further and further out, depending on how much the wind is blowing. That's a way to keep it level. Now, Mark's gospel says Jesus was asleep in the stern of the ship on the pillow. Now, stern of the ship I can understand because the only decking on that wreck is in the stern. The decking is where the helmsman would stand to guide the ship, the platform from which they would cast the nets. Therefore, the only protected spot is under that decking in the rear of the ship. Yeah, that's where Jesus can stay out of the light, the wet, the wind, the cold. He can take a snooze. Yeah. But now Mark adds this strange little detail. He was asleep on the pillow. Mark, don't you mean a pillow? And why do you give us a throwaway detail like that? No, Mark's using the definite article, the, not a, just as in English. Greek and English, same thing. Implying it's part of the boat's rigging. You would not speak of a rudder on this boat. You'd speak of the rudder. And so he talks about the cushion, the pillow. Well, now we know what that is, folks. The wind is coming up. Do you now want an eccentric hull going through the water? I don't think so. You strike the sails, right, as fast as you can. And now you got to get the thing back to balance. So you take your ballast sack. You stow it amidships in the rear. So now we finally know what Mark is telling us. Jesus is asleep in the stern of the ship on the ballast sack. That's what he's trying to tell us. So not till 1986 did we know how that happened. The good news is they finally impregnated all the wood on that craft, and so now they've drained the aquarium or swimming pool, and now it is high and dry, and you can see it again at Kibbutz Ginosar. You see how the name Gennesaret shows up today in the Holy Land. It's just amazing how these things are still there. Blue book, lower right hand. I don't know if you can see it at all. Probably not. But there you see the skeleton of the Jesus boat, as they started calling it. That's a little bit too much. There's no bronze plaque on the thing that says, Jesus slept here. No, nothing like it. But so it goes. When it comes to the Passion story, we have so much incredible documentation on everybody involved in that Passion story that to doubt that this happens shows the mark, really, of somebody who needs psychiatric help. I'm serious. No, it's so bad. Oh, and by the way, the Jesus dehumanizers are still around. There's a blog out there, JesusNeverExisted.com. Yeah. Those kind of people are right in the same bag as Holocaust deniers. We never killed those Jews. Good old Dwight Eisenhower had the right idea, told his photographers, take a picture of these bodies stacked on top of one another. Someday they'll deny it. And they have. And they have. Or people who doubt the Trilateral Commission, whatever that is. Or this, hey, I'll tell you this group. The same group that believes we never walked on the moon. It was all filmed in the Arizona desert outside of Phoenix. It's called insuperable ignorance. Yeah. No, let me tell you about the characters in the Good Friday account. Remember I told you I would tell you about the first biblical bones ever discovered? Okay, hands up, don't say it. Hands up for those who know who I'm talking about. You see how few there are? Hey, I'm not blaming the rest of you. I'm blaming the press corps for sitting on a story. Not intentionally. I don't want to get paranoid and say that, they're trying to keep the truth from you. Nah, I just think they didn't know how important a story this was. The discovery was made in November of 1990. A bulldozer was working south of the temple area in the Peace Forest in the old city of Jerusalem. Now, I should point out that a bulldozer is not your average archaeological tool. Brush, try brush. Yeah, not dozer. Well, the dozer was not intending a bit of archaeology. The dozer was building the base of a water park, blue plastic slides and all. It starts sinking into the ground, found that it had burst the roof of a burial cavern. So they backed it off, turned off the diesels, called in the archaeologists, and they then shined their flashlights down. They did not have to crawl inside that burial site to identify it chronologically. Immediately they said, 1st century CE, which means AD. 1st century. How did they know? 10 ossuaries were inside. What's an ossuary? It's a limestone chest for burying bones. They're running out of space in the Mount of Olives. And so they decided, let's do a space-saving way of burying people. They put a body in a sepulcher for a year or two, and then gathered the bones that remained, put them in this bone box, only about yay big, and then put the owner's name on the bone box, and then put that in a niche inside of a sarcophagus or bury it in the soil. And the only time they did that was in the 1st century. So right away they knew this is a New Testament horizon burial site. Now, one of these ossuaries was magnificently carved. Beautiful thing. I've never seen any ossuary like this. 2 giant rosettes with sub-whorls inside. And beautiful, fluting around the edges, implying there's a VIP inside there. And indeed, the name of the occupant or the owner of those bones shows up twice in Aramaic. And I'm going to give you the Aramaic, and I'll bet you know who I am talking about. I'll give you a hint. It's a fella, not a girl. And it comes from our Lenten readings, somebody you've all heard of. Are you ready? The name is Yosef bar Caiaphas. Yosef bar Caiaphas. Who am I talking about? Joseph. Caiaphas, indeed, the high priest who indicts Jesus before the bar of Pontius Pilate on Good Friday morning, a very important person in the Passion story. His bones are there. Yeah, they did a carbon-14 test on the bones. Again, BP 1930, 1940. They did another test showing the age of the bones at death. Dr. Bob Drews probably knows the name of that particular test. I don't. But in any case, it showed the death of a 65 to 70-year-old man. Nobody else named Caiaphas. The location is perfect. Other members of his house discovered in neighboring tombs. Has to be the one. A thrilling discovery of the chief prosecutor on Good Friday. Nay more. What about Pontius Pilate? Pilate, of course, was totally intriguing to me earlier in my research, simply because here is a human bridge between Rome and Palestine. He's Rome's man in Judea. And we know a lot more about Pilate from secular evidence out there, from Josephus, from Tacitus, from Philo and others. And therefore, I was fascinated to see if his secular story comports well with the biblical story or not. If it didn't, then you believe the one or the other. Well, the answer is it comports perfectly and explains so much of what's taken place in the gospel record, giving us additional detail. And now look what happened when Bruno Bauer, one of the great agnostics around in the late 1800s, I should say, claimed that Jesus of Nazareth never even lived as a human being. And he also added, anytime Jesus is speaking to anybody, that person also vaporizes into non-existence. If somebody is talking to Zeus in ancient history, well, that's mythology. But even Bruno's colleagues in Germany were saying, yeah, aber, what a minute. Pontius Pilate is well known in Roman and Jewish history. You know what Bruno answered? No. Those are interpolations. Christian scribes trying to make the Bible look good added Pilate's name to Tacitus and the others. I wish old Bruno had hung in there rather than going to his reward, or whatever direction that was, because I'd have loved to have gotten this guy in an arm lock, and his head anyway, and just rubbed that unbelieving nose of his in the inscription of a cornerstone they discovered in Caesarea, and following is in 2-inch Latin lettering in that cornerstone. To the people of Caesarea, Pontius Pilate, the prefect of Judea, has presented the Tiberium, a building in honor of the Emperor Tiberius. I really wish he could have had that experience. Yes, Virginia, there really was a Pontius Pilate. In the blue, we don't have time to pass it around, but the blue book, we have indeed, in the fullness of time, picture of that Pilate stone on the left there. And by the way, also a picture of the Caiaphas ossuary. And I wish we did have time to pass this one around in color in the Eusebius book. Beautiful, beautiful carving around the whole thing on all sides.
Dr. Maier, we are past 4 o'clock. I have no trouble with you continuing to speak.
Yeah, but I do. Determines what's left of my voice. As you'll notice from the outline, there are many other things we could have talked about, right? There are many other items that were not covered in the oral presentation. Just know that these things are there. They're overwhelmingly, all of them, in a gigantic antiphonal chant are telling us that, yeah, the Bible is true, it's true, it is true, in terms of the hard evidence that is out there. In the case of the Blue Book, Fullness of Time, the first half of it shows all the new information we know on Jesus on the basis of archaeology, and the second half of that book tells us all the new information we have on St. Paul, because when we get to Paul's ministry, and he takes the good news out of the backwaters of the Mediterranean in Palestine and brings it into the mainstream of Asia Minor, Greece, Italy, Rome, the needle goes off the scale. Every move that Paul makes, we can bring in now secular material to show you how good Luke's record is in the book of Acts. I mean, Luke has it down pat so beautifully, calling the governors by their proper name. Anybody else would say the governor of Greece. Luke says the proconsul of Achaia. That's exactly the name when the Romans took over from the Greeks. My favorite guidebook when we get to Corinth is not Fodor's or Baedeker. My favorite guidebook is Acts 18. Because you can go through the ruins there, say, yep, that's where that happened. Yeah, that is where Paul stood before Gallio. Gallio was facing north that day. Out of the sun, he could rejoice in the cool blue of the Gulf of the turquoise Gulf of Corinth. Paul had to face the sun as he's facing the Acrocorinthos. I mean, right to the very square foot of where Paul stood, this kind of thing. And we can see the meat market where it talks about meat sacrificed to idols. We can see the synagogue and the lintel over the synagogue where Paul taught, you recall, for 18 months there. Ho synagoge ton Hebraion. In Hebrew, there it is. Thrilling thing to see how these things come to life on sight. So indeed, there is no other faith in the world that can back up its holy book with this kind of evidence. Our Hebrew ancestors, the Jewish brothers and sisters, can indeed do it for the Old Testament. But again, the overpowering the incidents we have in the New Testament just brings tears to the eye. And again, I'll say it once more. Before you people pass on, there will be additional dramatic archaeological discoveries, which will, if precedent is any rule for the future, it will automatically support the biblical record, as it has in the past. And you can't tell what may be out there yet in terms of what can be discovered. Thrilling time to be alive. You people, whether or not you know it, you either know more or you can know more about how Christianity got started than any of the greatest names in church history. Sounds almost heretical to say that. You know far more than Martin Luther. Luther would have loved archaeology. You know, he's a nuts and bolts character. He would have run with it. Wasn't available. You know more than Thomas Aquinas, the great Roman Catholic theologian. You probably know more than St. Augustine. St. Augustine didn't know Greek in the Greek sources. You probably know more or can know more. Your database is bigger than any time in church history since the eyewitness generation and maybe one or two afterwards. So it's a thrilling time to be alive. We're a privileged group to enjoy the results of good biblical research. 2,000 years of it has been really very, very good, and the blessings of archaeology. Enough for me. Concluding questions.
Jim.
Dr. Maier, could you address the issue, and you had it on your list, of the spike that was found in the crucified man? Because before that, crucifixion had been denied because there was no evidence.
Yeah, a very important one that I didn't mention. Again, the picture of the bones transfixed with the 7-inch spike. They used to doubt, again, that they would crucify by nailing. They would tie them to the cross because, the human palm is too fragile. And, hey, that's nutty because in the case of this crucified victim, which they discovered, page 166, by the way, in the Blue Book, you will find the wooden remains under the head of a 7-inch spike with a fish hook at the end of the spike. Because as they were nailing it into an olive wood cross, they hit a nut, kept nailing it, and it turned into a spike. They couldn't get it down, so they hacked the whole affair down. But right beneath the head of that 7-inch spike is acacia wood. See, they didn't go to Ace Hardware and get a metal washer. They used acacia wood, a wooden plaque or shim as your thumbtack, really. Now you can put any part of the human hand on that you want.
All right. We have a few more questions right here.
At the time of Jesus' death, we were told in the scripture that there was dark from noon till 3. I have heard rumors that there is some evidence in writing of that. Could you tell us?
Yeah, there's a very good question, and indeed there is. You wouldn't expect it, but there it is. His name is Phlegon, Phlegon. He's a Greek Ripley. Remember Believe It or Not by Ripley? Yeah, and most of what you had there were these strange things, and most of them were true, as a matter of fact, yeah. So here this guy, Phlegon, a Ripley type, is writing about extraordinary things that he came across in his life. And he's from Caria, which is southwestern Asia Minor. And he says that in the 4th year of the 4th month of the 202nd Olympiad, there was darkness in the daytime, so much so that you could see stars at noon. And there was an earthquake which toppled many of the buildings in Nicaea, where he was at the time, the very Nicaea where our later Nicene Creed would be formulated. Now, it turns out that the 4th year, the 4th month of the 202nd Olympiad is April of 33 AD, which is my favorite date for the crucifixion. I didn't come at that date because of Phlegon, but once I had that date, the Good Friday was 3rd of April, 33 AD. But once I had the date, to see that it was nicely corroborated this way, that was pleasant. Yep, good point.
All right. Otto?
Put the mic pretty close to your mouth.
Is anybody searching for the remnants of Pharaoh's army at the bottom of the Red Sea?
Anybody searching for what?
Pharaoh's army at the bottom of the Red Sea.
At the bottom of the Red Sea, yeah. Indeed they are, and they are repeatedly. And they will, again, you've seen chariot wheels that are passed on on internet blogs and this kind of thing. That's somewhat questionable about that. Again, if we knew exactly the route of Pharaoh's army, then it might be easier. Again, the transit probably took place at the Bitter Lakes region in the shallows of what was later turned into the Suez Canal. The Bitter Lakes are part of the Suez Canal system. And it's not really the Red Sea, it's the Sea of Reeds, Reed Sea, yeah.
All right. Stan, okay, let's go to the nice young lady on the arm of Jules Bush.
Why is ISIS killing Christians?
A little louder, please, right in the microphone.
Why is ISIS killing Christians? And aside from the fact that the Quran exhorts all Muslims to kill the infidel.
Of course, when you get to Islam and ISIS and questions like that, we could spend the rest of the day and into the evening on that one. I have a separate seminar on the crescent versus the cross in which we take all that up. It all goes back, they claim, to Abraham, not trusting God that Isaac was coming along. And so Sarah, in a very generous gesture that I don't think any of you wives would put up with today, allowed her husband to have, again, marital relations with a maid. And the result was Ishmael becomes Abraham's firstborn, and know how important the firstborns are. And so therefore, Muhammad tees off on that one and therefore claims to also be a biblical faith right in the monotheistic traditions of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. Trouble is, it's 6 centuries down the road. It's derivative. It's always secondary and tertiary. Its evidence can never compare with that of Judaism and Christianity.
I think we have 2 more questions. Gentleman right here.
In your Constantine Codex, which is excellent, by the way, you mention a Shimon or Simon, a cousin of Jesus, a bishop of Nazareth. I've never heard him. Could you tell us about him?
I'm trying to think. A bishop of Nazareth?
Page 79 in the Codex.
Page.
Know it well. What do
was
I
that
say?
second or third paragraph?
What do I say? No. What do I say in that page 79?
He's got the spelling of his name. Maybe that'll help you.
Doctor, the spelling that you had in the, I hung on every word of that book. That's why I asked. The spelling of his name was Symeon.
So, Simeon by chance? Simeon?
Simeon, Jesus' cousin, was the second bishop of the church in Jerusalem, yes. Yeah, we got that from Eusebius.
Eusebius
Yep.
tells us that.
Yep.
All right. And Dr. Ford, I believe, has our last question.
Did you say that Good Friday was the 3rd of April, 33 AD?
3rd of April would be, in 33 AD would be Good Friday. The first Easter would be April 5th.
All right. Thank you, Dr. Maier.